Hello, boys and girls. Do I have a treat for you today? Not one story, not two stories, but three stories I'm going to tell you. All three involve God's people, the children of Israel, and their very famous leader, a man called Moses. A couple of the stories involve a really nasty, wicked, bad king, a Pharaoh. So watch out for him because he's not at all a nice man. But the most important person in these three stories is God himself. So as we read these stories, watch out for what God says and what God does, because that's really, really important. So the first story is called God to the Rescue. Joseph and his brothers grew old and died, but their children's children stayed on in Egypt, where they became a very, very large family. Later on, a new king began to rule, but this Pharaoh didn't remember Joseph, and he didn't like God's people. He made them his slaves and beat them and made them work harder and harder. God's people cried out to God to rescue them, and God heard them. He remembered his promise to Abraham. He would look after his people. He would find a way to set them free. One day Moses was looking after sheep when something caught his eye, a bush behaving very oddly. It was flickering with flames, but its leaves weren't burning up. He took a closer look. "Moses!" boomed a big voice. Moses leapt back. The bush was talking to him. "I have heard my people's cries," God said. "I have seen their tears, so I have come down to rescue them. Go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go." Moses was afraid, but God said, "I will be with you." So Moses went to Pharaoh. "Pharaoh," Moses began, "God says." "God," said Pharaoh. "Never heard of him." Moses kept going. Moses said, "Let his people go free." "Why should I?" Pharaoh said. "Don't want to, won't." So he didn't. So God gave Pharaoh 10 warnings called plagues. First, God turned the river Nile into blood. No one could drink the water. But still Pharaoh would not let them go. So God made frogs come hopping and leaping and jumping. In your bed, frogs. In your hair, frogs. In your soup, frogs. All over everywhere, frogs. "Make them go away," Pharaoh screamed. "Then your people can go." So God took the frogs away. But Pharaoh changed his mind. "You can't go," he said. Then God sent zillions of gnats. But still Pharaoh said, "No." And then God sent swarms of flies, flies buzzing in your eyes, flies. And after that, sickness and horrible boils and huge hailstones and storms of locusts, then darkness when it should have been day, until it seemed that the whole world, creation and everything was coming undone, falling back into darkness and emptiness and nothing. Each time Pharaoh said, "Make it stop, and then I will let them go." And each time when God made it stop, Pharaoh changed his mind and said, "Actually, no, you can't go." Finally, Moses warned Pharaoh, "Obey God, or he will have to send the worst thing of all." Pharaoh just laughed. God said, "The oldest boy in each family of Egypt must die, but my people will be safe." God told his people to take his best lamb, to kill it, and to put some of its blood on their front doors. When God passed over your house, Moses explained, God will see the blood and know that your lamb has died instead of you. That night, it was just as God had said. Suddenly, piercing the darkness, echoing down the corridors of the palace, came a blood-curdling scream. Pharaoh's oldest son had died. And at last Pharaoh did what God said. "Get out!" Pharaoh shouted. "Just go!" And so that very night, Moses and God's people fled out of Egypt and out of slavery. They were free at last. God's people would always remember this great rescue and call it Passover. But an even greater rescue was coming. Many, many years later, God was going to do it again. He was going to come down once more to rescue his people. But this time, God was going to set them free forever and ever. Our second story is called God Makes a Way. Moses and God's people escaped out of Egypt and into the wilderness. They didn't know the way, but God knew the way and he would show them. I will bring you to a new home, a special land, God promised them. I will look after you. I am with you. God sent a big cloud for them to follow, a pillar of smoke stretching up to the sky. It moved in front of them as they walked and shaded them from the blazing heat of the day. And when it was time to rest, it stopped. All through the cold desert nights, it kept them warm, glowing like fire. God led his people through the desert to the edge of a great sea. They were just wondering how to cross it when suddenly they heard a terrible thundering and pounding. It sounded almost like horses' hooves. They shaded their eyes to look back and screamed. It was! Pharaoh and his army were coming after them. Pharaoh had changed his mind again. Get my slaves back, he screeched, and charged out into the desert after them with 600 of his fastest horsemen and every single chariot in Egypt. What were God's people going to do? In front of them was a big sea. It was so big there was no way around it. And there was no way through it. It was too deep. And they didn't have any boats, so they couldn't sail across it. And they couldn't swim across it because it was too far and they would drown. And they couldn't turn back because Pharaoh was chasing them. They could see the flashing swords now glinting in the baking sun and the dust clouds in the chariot after scary chariot surging towards them. So they did the only thing there was left to do. They panicked. We're going to die, they screeched. Don't be afraid, said Moses. But there's nothing we can do, they screamed. God knows you can't do anything, Moses said. God will do it for you. Trust him and watch. But there's no way out, they cried. God will make a way, Moses said. Another minute and it would all have been over, but the strangest thing happened. God made the pillar of smoke move. It moved behind the people and hid them from the Egyptians. Then God sent a strong east wind to blow all night long. It blew in the water of the big sea. It blew to the left and it blew to the right, and it blew into two towering walls of water. And there, right through the middle of the sea, a muddy pathway opened up, and God's people walked across on dry land. When the Egyptians tried to follow, the walls of water crashed back down on them and swallowed them up. God's people were safe. They danced and laughed and sang and thanked God. Where there had been no way out, God had made a way. Many years later, once again, God was going to make a way where there was no way. From the beginning, God's children had been running from him and hiding. God knew his children could never be happy without him, but they couldn't get back to him by themselves. They were lost. They didn't know the way back. But God knew the way, and one day he would show them. So that brings us to our third story. It was good to hear that Pharaoh got what was coming to him because he had treated God's people so very, very badly. This third story is called 10 Ways to be Perfect. So there they all were. Grannies, granddads, babies, uncles, aunts, children, mums and dads, out there in the middle of the desert. They had blisters from all the walking. They were hungry, they were thirsty, and much, much too hot. We don't like it, they said. It stinks. And so they did, for that matter, because no one had taken a bath in weeks. Now remember, because this is something that they had forgotten, God had done amazing things for his people. He had hidden them inside a cloud. He had moved the sea. He had set them free. But God's people were still not happy. They didn't care about being free. Wasn't it better when we were slaves? At least we had lots of nice food to eat. God doesn't want to make us happy, they said. It was the same lie that Adam and Eve had heard all those years ago. God has brought us out here to kill us. God doesn't love us. But they didn't know God very well, did they? Every day of their journey, God kept showing his people how well he would look after them if just they would trust him and obey him. When they were hungry, God made the sky rain with food. Bread came down from heaven. What is it? They asked each other. They didn't know, so they called it, what is it? Which of course is a very good name for something when you don't know what it is. When they were thirsty and started quarreling, God made water flow from a rock. God called that place Quarreling, because that seemed like a good name too. And still God's children didn't trust him or do what he said. They thought they could do a better job by looking after themselves and making themselves happy. But God knew there was no such thing as happiness without him. So God led them to a tall mountain. God wanted to talk to his people and show them what he was like. He wanted to help them to know him better and to tell them about the special land he was going to give them. The whole world belongs to me, God said, but I have chosen you. You are my special family. I want you to live the way that I want, so that everyone else will see what I'm like, so that they can know me too. God called Moses up a mountain. The great mountain shook. A thick cloud fell. Thunder roared. Lightning crackled. And God gave Moses 10 rules called commandments. I want you to love me more than anything else in the world and to know that I love you too, God told him. That's the most important thing of all. God gave them other rules like don't make yourselves pretend gods, don't kill people or steal or lie. The rules showed God's people how to live and how to be close to him and how to be happy. They showed how life works best. God promises to always look after you, Moses said. Will you love him and keep these rules? We can do it. Yes, we promise. But they were wrong. They couldn't do it. No matter how hard they tried, they could never keep God's rules all the time. God knew they couldn't, and he wanted them to know it too. Only one person could keep all the rules, and many years later God would send him to stand in their place and be perfect for them. Because the rules couldn't save them. Only God could save them. And of course that perfect person who came to die in our place was Jesus himself. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a really good week.
Noah built the most enormous boat that kept the birds and animals afloat. The Lord was good, the Lord was strong, and Noah lived his life for him. Moses led his people through the sea, taking them away from slavery. get to know our God again. The Lord is good, the Lord is strong, and we will live our lives for Him.